Between February 2025 and February 2026, the Trump administration initiated a series of documented decisions to rename federal institutions, redirect infrastructure funding, and restructure federal spending priorities. These decisions generated legal challenges, congressional disputes, and administrative proceedings that are ongoing. This analysis examines the verified record of those decisions, the legal frameworks that govern them, the institutional responses they produced, and the structural implications for federal governance. The roadmap is as follows. First, the confirmed record of institutional naming decisions and the legal authority questions they raised. Second, the federal infrastructure funding disputes and the documented mechanisms through which spending was redirected. Third, the broader budget restructuring announced in 2025 and its documented effects on federal programs. Fourth, three plausible scenarios for how legal and legislative processes may resolve these disputes. The institutional naming decisions began shortly after the start of the second Trump term. In January 2025, an executive order renamed the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America for official U.S. government usage. The order applied to federal agencies and official government documents, though international bodies and foreign governments are not bound by unilateral U.S. naming decisions. The United States Board on Geographic Names subsequently updated its domestic database to reflect the change, though the international geographic community uses its own naming conventions independently. The practical effect of the order was therefore limited to domestic official usage. In 2025, the administration renamed the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Colorado to the National Lab of the Rockies. The laboratory, established in 1974, had been designated as the primary federal research institution for renewable energy technologies. The renaming did not alter the laboratory's legal mandate or its budget allocation at the time of the change. The administration also renamed the U.S. Institute of Peace to the Donald J. Trump Institute of Peace. The U.S. Institute of Peace is an independent, congressionally mandated institution established in 1984 to promote conflict resolution and peace research. Legal questions about the extent of executive authority over the Institute's name and governance structure were raised, but had not been fully adjudicated as of February 2026. The Kennedy Council naming decision was the most legally contested of these changes. On December 18, 2025, the White House announced that the Board of Trustees of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts had voted unanimously to rename the institution the Trump Kennedy Center. Within 24 hours, construction workers added President Trump's name to the building's facade, creating the designation the Donald J. Trump and the John F. Kennedy Memorial Center for the Performing Arts. The White House issued a statement saying the board's vote reflected support for the president's role in strengthening the center's finances and programming. Several elements of this decision became immediately contested. Representative Joyce Beatty of Ohio, a Democratic ex officio member of the center's board, stated that she had been muted during the virtual board meeting and was prevented from voicing opposition. She later filed a lawsuit in federal court on December 22, 2025, alleging that the vote was conducted improperly and that the renaming violated federal law. Legal scholars at multiple institutions stated publicly that the Kennedy Center's name was established by federal statute, specifically legislation signed by President Lyndon Johnson in 1964, and that changing it would require an act of Congress. Georgetown law professor David Super stated that the administration cannot rename the building itself or the center itself without congressional authorization. Several Democratic lawmakers who serve as ex officio board members issued a joint statement calling the renaming a flagrant violation of the rule of law, undertaken without legal authority. The White House maintained that the board's vote was legitimate and that the renaming reflected the president's role as board chair. Trump had been elected chairman of the Kennedy Center's board in February 2025, following his appointment of new board members. The center's executive director, Richard Grenell, previously the U.S. ambassador to Germany, confirmed the name change. The administration also cited the inclusion of $257 million in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act for Kennedy Center repairs and maintenance as evidence of the administration's commitment to the institution. As of February 2026, the lawsuit filed by Representative Beatty remained active and the new signage remained in place. In a parallel process, the administration announced a new class of naval vessels to be named the Trump class. Navy Secretary John Phelan announced that the first vessel, designated the USS Defiant, would be the largest warship in U.S. naval history upon completion. The announcement followed a broader pattern of institutional renaming and branding initiatives. Discussions were also reported about the potential naming of the new Washington Commanders Stadium after President Trump, though no formal decision had been announced by February 2026. The Interior Department's 2026 America the Beautiful National Park Pass featured a side-by-side image of George Washington and President Trump to mark the nation's 250th anniversary. A conservation group filed a lawsuit challenging the decision on the grounds that it violated federal law governing the use of presidential imagery. This introduces a structural issue that requires closer examination. The legal framework governing institutional naming in the United States is distributed across multiple authorities. Some institutions are named through executive action, which the president can modify unilaterally. Others are named by act of Congress, which requires legislative action to change. Still others fall under agency administrative authority. The Kennedy Center, the U.S. Institute of Peace, and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory each have different governing statutes with different implications for naming authority. The administration applied similar executive action across institutions with varying legal frameworks, which produced different levels of legal exposure in each case. For the Kennedy Center, the legal consensus among constitutional scholars was that renaming required Congress. For the Gulf of Mexico, the executive order addressed domestic usage through agencies the president controls, a less legally contested action. For the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, the renaming occurred within the Department of Energy, an executive department under presidential authority. The distinction between these cases illustrates how the same policy objective, institutional renaming, has different legal implications depending on the statutory foundation of the institution in question. Federal infrastructure funding decisions followed a separate but parallel track. In early 2025, Secretary of Transportation Sean Duffy circulated a memorandum instructing the Department of Transportation to prioritize infrastructure funding for counties with marriage and birth rates above the national average. This criterion was not part of existing infrastructure funding statutes, which typically require cost-benefit analysis, safety considerations, and congressional authorization. The memorandum generated legal questions about whether executive agencies can apply criteria not established by statute when distributing congressionally appropriated funds. A more specific dispute emerged around Chicago infrastructure projects. The Department of Transportation placed on hold $2.1 billion for funding for two Chicago transit projects, the Red Line extension and the Red and Purple Line modernization. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt stated that the hold was related to the administration's concerns about race-based contracting practices the department characterized as inconsistent with constitutional requirements following the Supreme Court's ruling in Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard in 2023. The Department of Transportation stated it was reviewing the contracting arrangements on constitutional grounds. Illinois officials and Chicago city government disputed the characterization and argued the projects complied with applicable law. As of February 2026, the funding remained on hold pending the departmental review.
This creates a constraint that shapes the broader policy environment. The legal authority of the executive branch to withhold congressionally appropriated funds is a contested constitutional question. The Impoundment Act of 1974 generally prohibits the president from unilaterally refusing to spend funds that Congress has appropriated. The Trump administration has challenged this interpretation, arguing that the president retains constitutional authority over spending decisions. Senate Majority Leader John Thune separately suggested that a government shutdown, which began for the Department of Homeland Security in February 2026, gave the executive expanded authority to determine which programs are essential. Constitutional scholars and members of Congress from both parties disputed that interpretation, arguing that spending authority remains with the legislative branch under Article 1. The February 2026 DHS partial government shutdown began after Congress failed to reach a funding agreement before the DHS appropriations deadline. The impasse centered on oversight mechanisms for immigration enforcement following a shooting incident involving federal officers in Minneapolis. Democrats sought changes to immigration operations. The White House resisted those conditions. Congress went on recess until February 23, 2026, without a resolution. Agencies affected included the Transportation Security Administration, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the U.S. Coast Guard, the Secret Service, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and U.S. Customs and Border Protection. The federal budget submitted by the White House in May 2025 proposed $163 billion in cuts to non-defense discretionary spending for fiscal year 2026, representing a reduction of approximately 22.6% from projected current spending levels. Defense and border security spending were proposed for significant increases. The budget proposed eliminating funding for the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which funds the Public Broadcasting Service and National Public Radio, and AmeriCorps. Environmental Protection Agency funding was proposed for cuts exceeding 50%. National Science Foundation funding was also proposed for a reduction exceeding 50%. Education funding was proposed for a 15% reduction, though Head Start early childhood funding was preserved according to administration statements. Trump also signed an executive order instructing the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and federal agencies to cease funding for PBS and NPR. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting subsequently indicated it would challenge the executive order on the grounds that it is an independent entity whose funding is established by congressional appropriation rather than executive discretion. This dispute reflected a broader constitutional tension between executive directives and congressionally established funding structures that has recurred throughout the period. The key variable here is the distinction between policy preference and legal authority. The administration's stated objectives, reducing federal spending, restructuring institutional priorities, and establishing naming conventions that reflect the current administration's preferences, represent standard exercises of executive policy discretion in some respects. However, when those objectives intersect with institutions whose funding, governance, or naming is established by statute, the legal constraints on executive action become operative. The resulting disputes have moved into the judicial and legislative branches, where resolution timelines are difficult to predict. The Amtrak privatization discussion illustrates this pattern. The Department of Government Efficiency, led by Elon Musk, suggested that Amtrak could be privatized. Amtrak's existence and funding structure are established by the Rail Passenger Service Act of 1970, subsequently amended. Privatization would require congressional action. The CEO of Amtrak was reported to have been pressured to resign in 2025, which falls within standard executive authority over appointed leadership. But structural changes to Amtrak's legal status or funding model would require legislation. The administration's pattern of distinguishing between actions it could take unilaterally and actions requiring congressional authorization was not always clearly articulated, producing legal challenges at multiple points. Now, the second-order effect is where the structural analysis becomes more complex. Each contested executive action generates litigation. Litigation produces judicial decisions that either affirm or constrain executive authority. Those decisions then define the boundaries for subsequent actions. The accumulation of judicial precedents from the disputes over institutional naming, infrastructure funding holds, impoundment, and agency restructuring will collectively shape the legal framework within which future administrations operate. The outcomes of pending cases involving the Kennedy Center, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and the infrastructure funding holds are therefore significant beyond the immediate policy questions they address. Congressional dynamics add a further layer. The government funding dispute for DHS illustrated that divided congressional opinion, even within the Republican majority, limits the administration's ability to translate policy preferences into enacted law. The bipartisan support that passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act 427-1 in November 2025 demonstrated that congressional consensus can override administration preferences in specific areas. The infrastructure funding disputes have drawn attention from both parties, with governors and legislators from states affected by the Chicago funding hold responding regardless of party affiliation.
The scenario analysis proceeds from these documented conditions. Scenario A is the baseline. Legal challenges to executive naming decisions result in mixed outcomes. Courts uphold executive authority in cases involving institutions governed by executive branch statutes, while requiring congressional action for institutions whose names are established by federal law. The Kennedy Center case results in a ruling that the renaming requires an act of Congress, but enforcement of that ruling depends on congressional willingness to act. Infrastructure funding disputes are resolved through negotiated agreements between the Department of Transportation and affected jurisdictions, with the funding ultimately released after contractual modifications. The DHS shutdown resolves through a continuing resolution that funds the department without the oversight conditions Democrats sought. Federal budget cuts proceed at reduced levels following congressional negotiations that restore some funding to eliminated programs. In this scenario, the pattern of executive institutional action continues, but is progressively bounded by judicial and legislative responses. Scenario B involves escalation of the institutional disputes. If courts issue broad rulings affirming expansive executive authority over institutional naming and funding decisions, the scope of unilateral executive action increases. Additional institutions may be renamed, funding holds may be extended to other infrastructure programs, and the executive budget cuts may be implemented at levels closer to the proposed reductions. This scenario requires courts to defer substantially to executive interpretations of statutory authority, or to decline to issue enforceable orders. It also requires congressional inaction, either through political alignment with the administration's preferences or through procedural constraints that prevent legislative responses. In this scenario, the legal framework governing institutional naming and funding is significantly reshaped through a combination of executive action and judicial deference. Scenario C involves de-escalation through negotiated resolution. The administration reaches agreements with congressional leadership on infrastructure funding and institutional governance that provide the administration with naming recognition while preserving statutory frameworks. The Kennedy Center dispute, for example, could be resolved through legislation that formally adds Trump's name to the institution with Kennedy family and congressional agreement, achieving the symbolic objective through the legally required mechanism.
Infrastructure funding disputes could be resolved through modifications to contracting requirements that satisfy the administration's stated constitutional concerns while maintaining project timelines. This scenario requires greater executive willingness to work within statutory constraints and greater congressional willingness to accommodate administration's preferences through legislation. It is the least probable scenario in the short term, given the current adversarial posture between the executive and Congress on spending questions, but it represents the path of least institutional disruption. What the confirmed record shows is this: between February 2025 and February 2026, the administration took a series of documented actions involving institutional naming and federal funding that generated legal challenges at multiple points. The pattern reflects a consistent approach, applying executive authority broadly across institutional domains, including areas governed by congressional statute, and defending those applications through administrative and legal processes. The legal outcomes of pending cases remain uncertain, and the full implications of budget cuts for affected programs will become clearer as fiscal year 2026 appropriations are finalized. Congressional responses have been varied, with some actions drawing bipartisan opposition and others proceeding with limited legislative resistance. The structural questions raised by these developments are not unique to this administration. The boundaries of executive authority over congressionally established institutions, the legality of impoundment, and the executive's role in institutional naming have been contested in prior administrations as well. What distinguishes the current period is the scale and simultaneity of challenges across multiple institutional domains, which is creating a more comprehensive body of litigation and legislative response than is typical. Whether that body of legal activity produces durable clarifications of executive authority or remains contested across administrations is a question that extends beyond the current policy disputes into the longer-term architecture of American constitutional governance. The confirmed facts are these: the Kennedy Center lawsuit is active. The Chicago infrastructure funding remains on hold pending review. The DHS partial shutdown was in effect as of February 17, 2026. The proposed federal budget cuts have been submitted but not enacted. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act, signed July 4, 2025, established the current statutory baseline for spending. What remains uncertain is the outcome of active litigation, the resolution of the DHS funding impasse, and the final form of fiscal year 2026 appropriations. Those outcomes will define the operational scope of the executive naming and spending decisions documented here. We will continue tracking confirmed updates as they emerge from courts, Congress, and agency proceedings. If you have access to official documents, court filings, or legislative records relevant to these developments, sharing them contributes to the factual record.